Alarms first, not words. I was 3 hours into a sleep cycle when the deck lights turned red and my bunk started shaking under me. My name is Nora Ashby, and on that morning I was a communications officer on a listening station called the Harbinger, parked quietly at the edge of our solar system, doing a job nobody back home even knew existed. Watching the dark, listening for anything that did not belong there. Something did not belong there. I hit the corridor, still pulling my boots on. Marcus Kelly, our systems engineer, was already at his station, and his face told me everything before he said a single word. Nora, you need to see this. On the main screen was a ship. Not a ship the way we understood ships. It filled half the display, and the display was tuned to show objects 100,000 kilometers out. It had arrived without a warp flash, without an engine burn, without anything our sensors recognized as travel. One moment the sky was empty, the next, it was not. How long has it been there? I asked. 11 seconds, Marcus said. Give or take forever. I want to tell you I felt brave. I did not. My stomach dropped the way it does on the first hill of a roller coaster. That one horrible second where your body understands something your brain has not caught up to yet. Every hair on my arms stood up. My hands were doing something close to shaking. Then the message came through. It arrived in every language we had on file, all 300 of them, stacked and overlapping, translated by something that clearly did not care how strange it sounded to human ears. People of Earth. You are addressed by the concordance of 1,000 suns. Your world has been assessed and claimed under Article 7 of Interstellar Expansion Protocol. You will surrender all military assets, cease independent governance, and submit to concordance authority within one full rotation of your homeworld. Non-compliance will be treated as hostile resistance. Silence on the bridge, the kind of silence that has weight. Then Marcus laughed. Not a small laugh, a real one, the kind that comes up from somewhere below the ribs, the kind you cannot stop once it starts. And it should not have made sense, because we were staring at a ship the size of a small moon that had just told us to give up our entire planet in 24 hours, and the correct response was terror. But I felt it too. It climbed up my throat before I could stop it, mixed in with the fear so tight I could not tell where one ended and the other began. I laughed until my eyes were wet, and I was not entirely sure anymore if I was laughing or something else. One day, I said, wiping my face. They gave us one day. Guess they're in a hurry, Marcus said. I keyed the channel back to Earth Command before the humor could fade into something less useful. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Command, this is Harbinger Station. We have contact. Repeat, we have contact. Sending full sensor data now, and command, they want an answer inside 24 hours. There was a pause on the other end. Then Captain Daniel Pierce's voice came through, low and even, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years training himself not to sound the way he probably felt. Understood, Harbinger. Hold position. Do not, under any circumstances, respond to that ship. Stu means Thew. Copy that, sir. I looked at Marcus. What do we do instead? We watch, he said, and we wait for the grown-ups to figure out what a moon-sized threat means for breakfast plans. I want you to understand something about that day, because it matters for everything that came after. Nobody on Harbinger Station believed we were going to win. Not really. Not in the part of the brain that does math. We had done the math already, every one of us, in the seconds after that message finished playing. A ship that size did not need to fire a single shot to end an argument. It could simply exist near your planet, and everyone would understand who was in charge. And yet, there is a thing that happens to people who come from a species built entirely out of surviving impossible odds against itself. You do not hand us a deadline and expect us to fold quietly. You hand us a deadline and something old wakes up, something that has nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with instinct, honed over 10,000 years of never once agreeing to lose without a fight, even the fights we started against each other. By the time the second hour passed, Earth was not panicking. Earth was organizing. I watched the feeds come in from every corner of the planet, patched through to our little station at the edge of everything. Shipyards that had been mothballed for a generation were suddenly bright with welding light. Old defense treaties, dusty and half-forgotten, were being pulled out and signed within minutes, because nobody had the patience left for slow diplomacy. Nations that had not agreed on anything in decades were suddenly sharing launch codes, like it was the easiest thing in the world. They're actually doing it, Marcus said, staring at the feed. They're building a fleet in a day. Not building, I said. Waking up. We've had this fleet the whole time. We just never needed to use all of it at once. He looked at me. You think we can win this? I didn't answer right away. I thought about my grandmother, who used to tell me stories about a war so large it swallowed whole continents, about men and women who fought with nothing but grit and steel, and the refusal to accept that losing was an option. I thought about how every single conflict my species had ever survived started the exact same way: hopeless odds, an enemy certain of an easy victory, and a species too stubborn to notice it was supposed to be afraid. I think, I finally said, that whoever wrote that ultimatum has never actually read a history book. 12 hours in, the Concordance ship moved. Not toward Earth, toward us. The listening station's proximity alarm screamed through the corridor, and for one long moment I thought Harbinger was going to be the first casualty of a war that had not technically started yet. Marcus's hands flew across his console. They're scanning us, he said. Deep scan. They know we're here. Do we run? Running is cute, he said. But I don't think that ship needs to chase anything. I think it just needs to want something dead. I keyed the emergency channel to command, my voice tighter now than it had been all day. Command, Harbinger. The primary vessel is moving on our position, requesting instruction. The response, when it came, was not from Captain Pierce. It was from a voice I did not recognize, calm in a way that made the calm itself unsettling. Harbinger, this is Fleet Command. Hold position. You are not the target. Repeat, you are not the target. Then what is? Nobody answered that question, not directly, not for another 2 minutes, which is a very long time when a ship the size of a small moon is turning slowly in your direction, like a predator, deciding whether you are worth the effort. Then the scanning stopped. The great ship simply drifted back to where it had been, patient as stone, and something in me understood, with a cold little shiver, that it had not been hunting us at all. It had been counting us, measuring us, filing us away as a small and insignificant piece of a much larger picture, the way you might glance at an insect on a windowsill before deciding it is not worth your attention. That, more than the ultimatum itself, was the moment I stopped being afraid in the ordinary way, and started being afraid in the way that makes you useful, instead of frozen. Because being underestimated by something that powerful was not a threat, it was an opportunity, and every person on Earth was about to prove it. 20 hours in, I finally slept, or tried to. Marcus took the watch, and I lay in my bunk listening to the low hum of the station and thinking about the countdown ticking away somewhere on a wall on Earth, one that would decide whether the next chapter of human history was written by us or for us. I dreamed about my grandmother's stories, ships and soldiers and stubborn refusals to kneel. When I woke, 4 hours had passed, and the counter had less than an hour left on it, and the entire solar system had gone very, very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before something enormous. I sat up, pulled my boots on, and went back to my station, because whatever was about to happen, I did not want to miss a single second of it. The countdown reached 0 at exactly 6 in the morning, station time, and nothing happened. No explosion, no beam of light tearing through the atmosphere, just a long, terrible pause, where every screen on Harbinger showed the same enormous ship sitting exactly where it had been sitting for a full day, unmoved, unbothered, waiting for a surrender that was never going to come. Command, I said into the channel, this is Harbinger. Deadline has passed. No change in enemy position. Please advise. The answer came from Captain Pierce this time, and there was something in his voice I had not heard from him before. Not fear. Something closer to pride, worn thin and sharpened into resolve. Harbinger, all stations. This is Fleet Command. The Concordance Vanguard is moving. All human vessels are cleared for defensive engagement. God help them. I watched it happen on the long-range display, a slow unfolding of shapes I had never seen assembled together in one place. Aircraft carriers converted overnight into orbital platforms, mining vessels with railguns bolted to their hulls by engineers who had been welding without sleep for 18 hours straight. 3 decommissioned submarines that someone in a fit of desperate genius had decided could be retrofitted with vacuum seals and thrusters, because apparently if it could survive the ocean floor, someone believed it could survive the void too. It should not have worked. None of it should have worked. I kept waiting for someone to call it off, to admit that we were fielding a patchwork fleet against something built by an empire that had apparently been conquering worlds for longer than our species had known how to write. Nobody called it off. "They're actually doing this," Marcus said. His voice had lost all of its earlier humor. What replaced it was something quieter and more dangerous. "Focus. We're actually doing this," I corrected him. The Concordance Vanguard came in first. 6 ships, sleek and matched, moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of centuries of drilled discipline. Beautiful, in the cold way a blade is beautiful. They expected surrender. Their formation said so. Wide, unhurried, arranged more like an arrest than an attack. They got return fire instead. I will never forget the first shot. It came from one of the retrofitted mining ships, the Cormorant, a vessel that 3 days earlier had been hauling ore out of an asteroid belt and had no business being anywhere near a war zone. Its railgun round crossed the distance faster than my display could properly track, and it struck the lead Concordance ship along its flank. The Concordance ship did not explode. It staggered. A visible ripple ran across its hull, shields flaring gold and then dimming, and for 1 full second, the entire bridge of Harbinger Station held its breath together. Then it cheered, all of us, even me, even though I knew, somewhere under the noise, that a single staggered shield meant almost nothing against 6 warships built by an empire spanning 1,000 suns. "They felt that," Marcus said, disbelief cracking his voice wide open. "They actually felt that." "They're not used to being hit," I said. "You can see it in how they're moving now." He was right to be shocked. I watched the Concordance formation break, not into retreat, but into confusion. 6 ships that had clearly never drilled for an enemy who fired first, and asked questions never. Human ships poured through the gap that confusion created, smaller vessels weaving between the larger Concordance hulls, in patterns too erratic for their targeting systems to predict, because our pilots had learned to fly in atmospheres full of turbulence and each other's mistakes, and no algorithm built for orderly warfare knew what to do with genuine chaos. Somewhere in the static of a dozen overlapping channels, I heard a pilot laughing between maneuvers, the same wheezing, disbelieving laugh that had started this whole thing back on the bridge of Harbinger Station a day earlier. It was contagious in a way that should not have made tactical sense and somehow did, because a species that laughs in the face of its own funeral is a species that has already decided fear does not get to make the final decision. I lost track of Marcus's voice reading numbers for a while. I lost track of a lot of things. What I remember most clearly is the moment the second Concordance ship took a hit to its engine core and began venting atmosphere in a long silver plume, spinning slowly out of formation like something wounded and confused about why the world had suddenly turned against it. "That's one down," someone said on the open channel. I never learned who. "Don't count yet," Marcus muttered, watching the remaining 4 ships regroup with terrifying speed. "They're adapting." He was right about that too. The Concordance Vanguard reformed within minutes, tightening their pattern, and this time when they returned fire, it was precise in a way our first exchange had not prepared us for. I watched 3 of our smaller vessels vanish from the display within the space of 10 seconds, and the cheering on the open channel died as fast as it had started. "Casualties," Marcus said quietly, and I heard the 2 words underneath the one he said out loud. "People. Somebody's family." I did not have time to sit with that. None of us did. The battle kept moving, and my job was to keep information flowing between Harbinger and the fleet, which meant I had exactly no room to grieve in real time for names I did not even know yet. So I did what people do. I focused on something small. There was a coffee mug on my console, half full, gone cold hours earlier, and in the middle of tracking a battle that could end or save my entire species, I found myself irrationally furious that nobody had thought to bring more coffee to the station before all this started. It was a stupid thing to be angry about. I knew it was stupid even as I felt it, but it was easier to be angry about coffee than to feel, all the way down, what it meant that 3 ships full of people I would never meet had just stopped existing. "Nora," Marcus's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. "I need you sharp. Command's asking for a relay." I put the mug down and did my job. The battle stretched into its 2nd hour, then its 3rd. Human losses mounted, and so did Concordance losses, though theirs came slower, more grudgingly, each one a genuine surprise to a fleet clearly built around the assumption that resistance would be brief and orderly. What they had not planned for was a species incapable of being orderly, even when it tried. I watched Captain Daniel Pierce's flagship take a hit that should have crippled it, and instead watched it limp forward, weapons still firing, because someone on that ship had decided losing power to the shields was an acceptable trade if it meant one more shot landed home. I watched a formation of fighters split apart mid-maneuver, not because they panicked, but because two of the pilots got into an argument over comms about whose plan was better, and both plans somehow worked anyway, converging from different angles onto the same target, because neither pilot was willing to lose the disagreement badly enough to change course. "This isn't a battle," Marcus said at one point, half to himself. "It's a bar fight, with spaceships." He was not wrong, and somewhere in the middle of that bar fight, something began to shift. The Concordance Vanguard, 6 ships strong at the start, was down to 3. Their formation had broken entirely, each ship fighting on instinct rather than doctrine, because doctrine had nothing in its files for an enemy that treated warfare the way we treated everything else, with grief tucked behind grim jokes, with stubbornness dressed up as strategy, with a refusal to recognize when the smart move was surrender. By the 4th hour, the 3 remaining Vanguard ships broke off entirely, retreating toward the great ship that had started all of this, the one that had not moved once through the entire engagement, watching from a distance the way you might watch an experiment you were no longer certain of the outcome to. The channel went quiet. Not the terrible quiet from before. A different kind. The kind that comes after you survive something you were not supposed to survive. "Command," I said, my voice raw. "This is Harbinger. Enemy Vanguard is retreating." I say again, enemy Vanguard is retreating. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I thought the line had dropped. Then Captain Pierce's voice came through, quieter than I had ever heard it. "Copy that, Harbinger. Good work. Everyone, good work." Marcus sat back in his chair, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. On the screen, the great ship remained motionless, patient, unmoved by the loss of half its vanguard, and something about that stillness told me more clearly than any casualty count that this was not over. It was only the beginning of a much longer conversation, and the Concordance had just learned, in the worst possible way, that Earth intended to be part of writing it. 3 days passed before the great ship moved again, and in those 3 days, Earth did not celebrate. We buried people, thousands of them. I watched the names scroll across a memorial feed that Command kept open on a side channel, and every so often I recognized one, a pilot I had heard laughing over comms during the battle, a technician from a shipyard I had trained with years earlier. Grief has a strange shape when it arrives in a list of names, instead of a single face at a time. It does not hit you all at once. It hits you one name later, and one name after that, small, sharp cuts that never quite stop. Marcus found me in the galley on the 2nd day, staring at a cup of coffee I had not touched. "You should eat something," he said. "I should," I agreed, and did not move. He sat down across from me anyway, not pushing, just present, the way good friends learn to be when there is nothing useful left to say. We sat there a long time, long enough that the coffee went cold twice. "I keep thinking about the mug," I finally said. "What mug?" "During the battle, I got angry about coffee. People were dying, and I was mad about a stupid mug." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's not you being callous, Nora. That's you being human. Your brain needed somewhere small to put the fear, so it didn't swallow you whole. Coffee's about the safest place I can think of." I laughed. A small broken thing. Nothing like the laugh from the bridge 3 days earlier. Some coping mechanism. "Better than most," he said. And for the first time since the ultimatum arrived, I let myself cry a little, quietly, in a galley that smelled like burnt coffee and old metal, while my closest friend sat with me and did not once tell me to stop. On the 4th day, the great ship moved. It did not move toward Earth directly. It moved toward the shattered remains of its own vanguard fleet, drifting silently among the wreckage, as though counting its dead, the same way we had spent 3 days counting ours. I do not know if that empire grieved the way we did. I do not know if the beings inside that ship felt anything close to what I felt sitting in that galley, but something about the slow, deliberate way it moved through the debris told me it was not simply assessing damage, it was reconsidering. "Command," I said, watching the great ship's trajectory shift for the first time since its arrival. "The primary vessel is altering course. It's heading toward the inner system, toward Earth." There was no panic in the response this time. Just a grim kind of readiness, the sound of people who had already decided, 3 days earlier, exactly what they would do if this moment came. "Copy, Harbinger. All fleets, converge on defensive position Sierra. This is it. I want to tell you the second battle was easier, because we had already won once. It was not. If anything, it was harder, because now we understood exactly what we stood to lose, and understanding that does not make you braver. It makes you sharper, and it makes the fear sit differently in your chest, less like panic, and more like a blade you have learned to hold without cutting yourself. The great ship did not send another vanguard. It came itself, filling the display until there was nothing else visible on the screen, a presence so large it seemed to swallow the stars behind it. Every human vessel that had survived the first engagement gathered in front of it, small and stubborn and utterly unwilling to move. That thing could probably destroy the whole fleet without even trying, Marcus said, watching the numbers scroll past his console. Probably, I agreed, but it hasn't yet. Why not? I thought about that question for a long moment, watching the great ship hold its position at the edge of engagement range, neither firing nor retreating. Maybe it's not here to destroy us, I said slowly. Maybe it's here to understand us, and it can't do that if we're all dead. Marcus looked at me like I had said something either very wise or very insane, possibly both. Whatever the reason, the great ship did not open fire. Instead, 3 smaller vessels detached from its hull, sleek and unmarked, moving toward the human fleet at a measured, almost cautious pace. Captain Pierce's voice came over the open channel, tight with focus. Hold fire. Repeat, hold fire. Let's see what they want. The 3 vessels stopped at the edge of the fleet's formation, and a transmission opened, garbled at first, then clearing into words. We wish to speak, the voice said, with your commanding authority. There was a long pause across every human channel, the kind where you could feel 1,000 people simultaneously deciding whether this was a trap. This is Captain Daniel Pierce, Earth Defense Coalition, Pierce finally said. You have 5 minutes. The voice on the other end paused, as though 5 minutes was not a concept it had expected to be handed, like a deadline of its own. Your species, it said slowly, was assessed as non-resistant. The assessment was incorrect. You're welcome to update your files, Pierce said. Another pause, longer this time. We propose a temporary cessation of hostilities. We wish to understand the nature of your resistance before further engagement. I watched Marcus's jaw tighten. They want to study us, he said quietly, like we're some kind of experiment. Maybe we are, I said. Maybe that's exactly the opening we need. Captain Pierce must have thought the same thing, because his answer came without hesitation. Agreed. Cessation of hostilities, effective immediately. But understand this. If a single concordance vessel moves against Earth or any human ship during that time, we will treat it as an act of war, and we will respond in kind. Understood, the voice said, and something in its tone had changed, subtle but unmistakable. It was no longer speaking to an insect on a windowsill. It was speaking, however reluctantly, to something it had begun to consider an equal. The great ship withdrew to a holding position at the edge of the system, and for the first time in 4 days, the fighting stopped entirely. I sat back in my chair, exhausted in a way that went past my body, and settled somewhere in my bones. Marcus reached over and squeezed my shoulder once, briefly, the kind of gesture that says more than any words could. We're not done, he said. This is just the part where they figure out what to do with us. I know, I said, but for right now, nobody else has to die today. I'll take that. Outside the viewport, the great ship sat motionless against the stars, patient and enormous, and no longer certain of anything it had believed about us 4 days earlier. Somewhere behind its hull, an empire that had conquered 1,000 suns was reading a file on humanity that no longer made any sense to them, and I found myself, against every exhausted fiber of my being, almost feeling sorry for whoever had to write the updated version. Almost. The ceasefire lasted 6 days, and during those 6 days, Earth Command sent envoys of its own. I was not chosen to go. I stayed on Harbinger, relaying communications between the negotiating team and Earth, watching a screen full of numbers instead of faces, and somehow that distance made the tension worse, not better. Marcus stayed with me, and together we tracked every transmission that crossed our station, every pause, every shift in tone, trying to read an alien species through nothing but the shape of its silences. On the 3rd day, something changed. It started small. A concordance supply vessel, smaller than the warships, moving on a trajectory that skimmed too close to one of our unarmed relief convoys carrying medical supplies toward a damaged colony station on the edge of the asteroid belt. It was probably nothing. Probably just a navigation error, a ship cutting a corner it should not have cut. Probably. Nora, Marcus said, watching the trajectory lines converge on his display. That's not a coincidence course. Command, I said. opening the channel, my pulse climbing, despite everything I had told myself about staying calm during this ceasefire. We have a concordance vessel approaching an unarmed relief convoy, requesting guidance. The answer took too long to come. 11 seconds. I counted every one of them. Harbinger, hold the channel open. We're reaching out to the concordance envoy now. I watched the two ships close the distance on the display, the human convoy slow and heavy with cargo, the concordance vessel sleek and fast, and utterly indifferent to the 6 days of careful diplomacy that had been built between our species. My hands were steady on the console. My mind was not. "They're not slowing down," Marcus said. "Command, they are not slowing down. Repeat, the concordance vessel is not slowing down." Somewhere on the other side of that channel, I imagined there were people just as frozen as I was, watching numbers instead of faces, trying to decide whether 6 days of fragile peace was about to end over a supply ship that may or may not have simply made a mistake. Then the concordance vessel corrected course. Not by much, just enough to clear the convoy by a margin so thin it barely counted as a margin at all, and continued on, toward wherever it had actually been going the whole time, indifferent to the fact that it had just come within seconds of restarting a war. I let out a breath I did not know I had been holding, and beside me, Marcus did the same. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. There was nothing useful to say. We had both just watched, in real time, exactly how thin the thread was that everything now hung from. "That was close," Marcus finally said. "Too close," I said. "I don't think that was an accident." "Neither do I." We reported the incident, and command logged it, and the negotiations continued as though nothing had happened. But something had shifted in me that I could not quite put back the way it had been before. I understood, in a way I had not fully understood until that moment, that the great ship watching from the edge of our system was not the only threat we faced. There were factions within factions, voices within that empire, who did not believe in ceasefires, who saw 6 days of peace as 6 days wasted, and one of them had just tested how far they could push before someone pushed back. On the 5th day, we found out exactly how far. It happened at the negotiating station itself, a neutral platform assembled in the space between the human fleet and the concordance envoy vessels. I was monitoring the channel when the first alarm hit, sharp and sudden, cutting through 6 days of careful, hard-won calm, like a blade through paper. "Explosion at the negotiating platform," Marcus said, his voice gone flat with shock. "Nora, there's been an explosion." My hands moved before my mind caught up, pulling every sensor feed I could reach toward that platform, watching debris scatter across the display in a pattern that told a story I did not want to read. Human envoys had been on that platform. Captain Pierce had been on that platform. "Command," I said, my voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady. "Status on the negotiating team. Please, someone, tell me their status." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. When the answer finally came, it was not the answer I had braced for, and it was not the answer I had hoped for either. It sat somewhere in between, the way the worst answers always do. "Casualties confirmed," the voice said. "Captain Pierce is alive. 2 members of the envoy team did not survive." I do not remember exactly what I did in the minutes after that. I remember Marcus's hand on my shoulder again, steadier this time, grounding me the way it had in the galley days earlier. I remember staring at the debris field on the display and thinking about the mug again, that same stupid, useless focus my mind kept reaching for whenever the real weight of something became too large to hold directly. Investigation would later determine what I had already suspected in my gut. The explosion had not come from a malfunction. It had come from a device planted by a faction within the Concordance who rejected the very idea of negotiating with a species they still considered beneath consideration, no matter what the Vanguard's defeat had proven. Not every voice in that empire had learned the lesson their warships had already paid for in wreckage and silence. The great ship, when it finally responded, did something none of us expected. It did not retreat. It did not attack. It moved forward, slow and deliberate, and opened a channel directly to Earth Command, and the voice that came through it was different from the one we had heard 6 days earlier. Older, heavier, carrying something that, if I did not know better, I might have called shame. "This action was not sanctioned," it said. "The individuals responsible have been identified and removed from command. We extend formal apology and request continuation of the ceasefire." Captain Pierce's voice, when it answered, was rough with pain but unmistakably steady. "You'll forgive us," he said. If we ask for a little more than an apology this time, state your terms. And there, in the wreckage of a negotiating platform, and the grief of 2 more names added to a memorial feed that already had too many, humanity finally had the leverage it needed to stop simply surviving this encounter and start shaping what came after it. The terms took 11 days to write. I was not in the room for most of it, but I followed every hour of it from Harbinger Station, relaying data, patching channels, watching a process that felt less like diplomacy and more like 2 very different species, slowly learning how to speak a shared language neither of them had ever needed before. Captain Pierce led the human side of it, his arm in a sling from the explosion, refusing every suggestion that he step back and let someone else finish what he had started. I was there when it happened, he told me once, over a private channel, his voice tired but sure. I'll be there when it ends. The Concordance sent a different envoy this time, one who introduced itself simply as Vren, without rank or title, which I later learned was itself a kind of concession, a way of saying this conversation would not be conducted from a position of assumed superiority. I listened to the recordings later, once they were cleared for general release, and one exchange stayed with me longer than any other. Vren, near the end of the negotiations, asked a question that had clearly been sitting unspoken for the better part of 11 days. Your species knew, from the beginning, that you could not win a direct confrontation with our full fleet. Why did you fight anyway? Captain Pierce's answer was short, and I think it is the truest thing anyone said during the entire encounter. Because giving up without trying isn't in our programming. We don't have that setting. Vren did not have a response to that. Some silences, I have come to believe, are their own kind of answer. The treaty that emerged from those 11 days was unlike anything the Concordance had signed in its long history. Earth remained independent. Earth kept its fleet, battered and rebuilt, but its own. In exchange, humanity agreed to open trade and shared knowledge with the Concordance, a partnership built not on conquest, but on the kind of grudging, hard-earned respect that only comes from 2 sides who have genuinely tried to destroy each other and found, in the wreckage, something worth preserving instead. I stood on the observation deck of Harbinger Station the day the treaty was signed, watching the great ship finally begin its slow retreat from our system, no longer a threat, but something closer to an uneasy neighbor. Marcus stood beside me, quiet for once, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. You ever think about the file? He finally asked. What file? The one they had on us. Before all this. Pre-industrial. Resource poor. Tribal. He shook his head slowly. They're going to need a whole new one now. I laughed, quietly this time. Nothing like the wild, disbelieving laugh from the first hour of the ultimatum. This laugh had grief folded into it, and pride, and something that felt almost like peace. Let them write it, I said. We'll be here. I thought about the names on the memorial feed, the ones I would carry with me long after this station's mission ended. I thought about my grandmother's stories, the wars that shaped a species long before it ever looked up and saw a stranger's ship parked over its home. I thought about coffee mugs and stubborn pilots, and an engineer who compound out foolish plans in the middle of chaos, because sometimes the foolish plan is the only one brave enough to work. We were never the strongest species in that first encounter. We were never the most advanced, the best equipped, or the most prepared. What we had, the only thing we had, was a refusal to accept an ending someone else had already written for us, and it turned out that refusal was worth more than every advantage the Concordance brought to our door. Somewhere out among 1,000 suns, there is an empire updating its records, learning slowly and carefully what it means to share a galaxy with a species too stubborn to know when it is supposed to lose. I hope they read the whole file this time. I hope they read every page.